So today I want to talk about a cyber attack based on an exploit discovered by the American NSA, stolen by the Russians, and then used by the North Koreans. I am of course talking about WannaCry. In this video I'll talk about the origins of WannaCry, what happened during the attack, the aftermath, and then what lessons we can learn from this. And our story begins with this nifty little vulnerability discovered by the NSA. Now, it's no secret that governments use espionage to gather data on foreign governments and organisations that they're interested in. They do that through human agents, they do that through taking photos, they do that through trying to listen into phone calls, and they also do it increasingly with hacking. And it's because of this that the US NSA develop a lot of exploits for vulnerabilities that they discover. And back in sometime before 2017, they discovered a vulnerability in the SMB version 1 protocol that they developed an exploit for, which they called EternalBlue. Now, EternalBlue is really powerful. You could use it against a vulnerable machine to get admin access via SMB. If you're not familiar with SMB, it's what we use for mapping drives and sharing things like printers. It's a really common protocol. Now, version 1 has been considered insecure for a very long time, but lots of organizations, lots of services, lots of software still depend on it to work. And back in 2017, that caused us a massive problem. Now, SMB is used extensively in lots of organizations. It's mostly used in Windows environments, and that's probably why the NSA went to the trouble of discovering the vulnerability and creating the EternalBlue exploit for it. Now, at some point in early 2017 or maybe late 2016, a group called the ShadowBrokers, which is believed to have been the Russian state, gained access to a bunch of NSA tooling. It's not believed that they hacked in directly to the NSA. They probably compromised some sort of staging machine they were using that had some of their tooling on, and they stole a bunch of NSA tools. Included in that was the EternalBlue exploit. And then on the 14th of April 2017, the ShadowBrokers leaked the EternalBlue exploit out into the world for everybody to see. And you may wonder, if it was the Russian state, why didn't they just keep the vulnerability in the exploit for themselves so they could use it? We don't know the answer to that, but safe to say, very, very embarrassing for the NSA that they had discovered this vulnerability, they hadn't disclosed it to Microsoft, they had an exploit, and then that got compromised and got dropped into the wild. Now, a little bit more about EternalBlue. This was really, really bad. Often we get vulnerabilities that are maybe more theoretical, so there's not an exploit available for them, but in theory, somebody's identified that you could, if you had the access and the right tools, leverage a vulnerability to then go do something, be that remote code execution, denial of service, something of that nature. EternalBlue, though, was a fully packaged, ready to go, really easy to use exploit. In fact, if you want to see EternalBlue in action, you can head over to tools like Hack the Box, where there's machines where you can see, using things like Metasploit, just how super easy it is to use it to gain an admin shell on a vulnerable machine. Now, if we rewind a little bit, I said that EternalBlue got compromised and then leaked online in April 2017. Well, the NSA must have known these tools had been stolen, because in March 2017, Microsoft released a patch to close the EternalBlue vulnerability. Now, I don't think anyone really knows why this happened, but at some point in early 2017, after the EternalBlue exploit had been leaked online by the ShadowBrokers, hackers attributed to North Korea took the exploit, bundled it with what was some quite clunky ransomware, which in reality was actually just destructive malware, and somehow, either on purpose or by accident, released it into the world. Now, if you're not familiar with ransomware, that's malware or malicious software that will encrypt files and then extort the victim for the key to decrypt them. And if that ransom gets paid, the user gets the decryption key, they can decrypt their system or their files, and they can keep working. And what the North Koreans had done here, it wasn't just ransomware where it would compromise a machine and then encrypt files. It would still do all of that, but also it would then use the EternalBlue exploit, look for other vulnerable machines on the same network, and then move to that one, deploy its ransomware, and keep moving on. It could worm itself around an environment, and that's why this attack was so devastating. So the ransomware element of the North Korean scheme remains very confusing. So if you were compromised by this WannaCry worm, this ransomware, you would get a ransomware note with a Bitcoin address to pay the ransom to. But the address was the same for all victims. There's no way that if you paid it, and people did, that there was any way they could know who had paid it and who should they share the decryption key with? It's really confusing why they'd done this. And that makes me think maybe it was actually just destructive malware, i.e. malware that was intended just to destroy systems, that was kind of masquerading as ransomware. And the name that was given to the malware or the ransomware that North Korea had created was WannaCry. So the WannaCry attack began at 7:44 on the 12th of May 2017. And by the end of the day, it's believed to have compromised over 230,000 machines across 150 different countries. Now, I remember this day really well. At the time, I was working in banking in the UK in a threat intelligence role. And I remember us being really confused initially. The organisation I was working for wasn't impacted, but as we heard the news of this happening, we were so used to ransomware spreading by phishing, and all of our discussions with our intelligence partners and our peers as well in the industry was, where's the phishing email? Where's the sample of how this thing is getting around? And it wasn't until much later that we discovered that it was actually through the EternalBlue exploit over SMB. And it was in the afternoon of the 12th that a security researcher called Marcus Hutchins discovered within the code of this malware, the WannaCry ransomware, that there was a web domain. And he went along, he saw it wasn't registered, and he registered it, which is fairly common practice if you're doing malware analysis. Domains sometimes are used for command and control, and if you then own them or you're able to take them over, you get some great telemetry and some great intelligence about what that malware might be doing. But it transpired that in the code of the WannaCry ransomware, the first thing it did before it executed was look for this domain. And if that domain existed, it would stop running. It's kind of like a kill switch. And because Marcus registered it, for all the other victims, or most of the victims going forward, it would try and access that domain, and then straight away it would discover it was registered and it would stop running. Marcus had effectively triggered the kill switch for WannaCry and almost shut down the attack across the world. I say almost because there's lots of corporate environments that just don't allow unfiltered web access. They filter it, they proxy it, they control it, and often they block newly registered domains or unknown domains. So it's possible that lots of organizations, even after the kill switch had been triggered, WannaCry would still run because it wouldn't be able to access that web domain. Undoubtedly though, his actions must have saved hundreds of thousands of machines from being compromised, and undoubtedly lots and lots of companies from being disrupted. The impact of WannaCry was unprecedented. It made headlines across the world and impacted thousands of organisations. Here in the United Kingdom, our National Health Service, or our NHS, who provide all our healthcare, they were really badly hit by WannaCry. Now, I imagine they've got a very, or they certainly had in 2017, a very complex IT estate, undoubtedly lots of legacy equipment that either wasn't patchable, was out of support. I can't imagine they had a huge IT team, and they were massively vulnerable to this. By the end of the day, they had 70,000 machines encrypted by WannaCry. And that included devices like MRI scanners, machines that are running blood banks, machines supporting GP practices, hospitals. Everything was impacted. And this really shows the real world impact that by having, I don't want to say security vulnerabilities for them, I don't know their setup at the time or why they were in the position they were in, but it certainly shows the impact of a ransomware attack on an organisation such as the NHS. They had to cancel 20,000 appointments, and 5 accident and emergency departments across the UK had to close. I can't imagine the feeling if you'd arrived at an accident and emergency department, say with a sick relative, a sick child, looking for support, looking for medical assistance, and you're told they can't help you because of a cyber attack. Now, because the NHS is a public body here in the UK, there's some really good reports and inquiries that are available, and I'll leave some links to those in the description to this video, but they go into a lot more detail of the impact of this attack and the long tail it had as the NHS tried to get themselves out of this situation, trying to decrypt where they were available, because decryptors were becoming available to WannaCry, but also rebuilding infrastructure as they went along. And if you do read those reports, you'll see that the NHS, it's such a large organisation, but they just weren't prepared for a cyber attack of this scale. So you might be thinking, if there was a patch available for the vulnerability that EternalBlue and WannaCry ultimately exploited, if that patch was available 2 months before the WannaCry attack, why weren't people just patching their systems? Well, there's a bunch of fairly sensible reasons why some organisations weren't able to patch WannaCry and the EternalBlue exploit. In large enterprises, and the NHS is a really good example of this, before deploying patches, you've got to test them. You've got to find a window for when they can be deployed. Then you've got to find a method as well to confirm that they've worked. All of that sounds fairly straightforward, but when you bring in legacy IT that might be out of support, when you've got 24/7 operations, when you've got very difficult, potentially challenging stakeholders, it can become really tough just to do basic vulnerability management well. In addition, patching can actually break IT systems. And I've seen this myself where we've deployed the latest updates to tooling, including patches, and then it's broken other software that we have in our environment. And this can be super difficult to test. Again, if you take the NHS as an example, I doubt they've got spare MRI scanners or CT scanners hanging around so IT can go test vulnerability patches. It's a really tough area. And ultimately, the solution is really just people and process. We've already got the tech that can do vulnerability management, can detect vulnerabilities, can help us patch them, but it's the people, the expertise that we need to do that in a safe, controllable way. And for me, WannaCry really underscores the need for vulnerability management just to be a business as usual activity for IT security, and indeed wider IT teams. Deploying patches shouldn't be an annual or quarterly exercise you do maybe if you get time, because when something like EternalBlue and WannaCry come along, you need to move very, very quickly to ensure you're not caught out. I think the WannaCry attack also underscores the benefits of using defense in depth as a principle. So if you're not familiar with defense in depth, it's independent overlapping rings of defense or of controls. I've talked about it on my LinkedIn, I've got an article about it, and I've also got a YouTube video explaining it. It was clear in the case of the NHS and maybe some of the other WannaCry victims that once they were compromised by WannaCry, there was no compensating control, there was nothing else to stop that moving around their environment and encrypting other machines. Indeed, some organisations may not have patched because they thought that they weren't vulnerable internally. So I can see the logic that if you had SMB v1 and you were vulnerable to the EternalBlue exploit on your perimeter, you'd prioritise patching that. And you might think that, well, an attacker can't get into our environment then because we're patched. But obviously we think nowadays in terms of assumed compromise. And indeed, in the case of all of those who got hit by WannaCry, I'm sure there's some of them that had patched externally, hadn't got around to patching internally yet because they mistakenly thought that there's no way this can get into our environment. And I can see lots of situations where in a complex enterprise where you've got lots of connections out maybe to other businesses who may have different security practices to you, those connections may be over or may have been over in 2017, vulnerable SMB v1. I can see how this would be able to move around and how it was able to spread globally so quickly. So how do we protect against future WannaCry attacks? Well, if we go all the way back to when the NSA first discovered the vulnerability used by EternalBlue, and that must have been pre-2017, 2016, maybe even further back. There's something that now exists called the vulnerability equities process, which is all about when somebody like the NSA discovers a vulnerability, they can reason about, is it best to keep it for espionage, or would it be better to say, tell the vendor so we can all patch it and then fix that vulnerability. Obviously, if they keep it for espionage and then somebody else discovers it, the rest of us are none the wiser it exists, and then it gets exploited. I think WannaCry as well can underscore the benefit of a comprehensive third-party risk management program, and in particular, understanding how your enterprise or organization links to your suppliers or your customers or just other organizations. Is that via things like web portals, or is that via network links using things like SMB? Because when vulnerabilities like this come along, you either need to patch them, have compensating controls, or in some extreme cases, cut those links until you've got the confidence that those organizations you're connected to have met a security standard. I think another interesting lesson from WannaCry is the benefits of segmented network topologies. So where WannaCry was able to easily move around, if you've got a segmented network, and this is much easier said than done, believe me, it makes it really difficult for that to take place or for that to happen. If we take workstations as an example, it's very rare that people need to connect to a workstation over SMB. There are reasons why, there are cases, I think they're quite few and far between. So if you're in an environment that was vulnerable to EternalBlue and WannaCry, but you were blocking inbound SMB on workstations and potentially servers as well, makes it really hard, actually impossible, for that to worm itself around using the EternalBlue exploit because SMB is just not available to it. And another benefit of those host-based firewalls is incident response, or potentially compensating controls in the case of a critical vulnerability. So you might remember earlier I mentioned patching for some people can be really, really tough. If that's taken a little bit more time and you've got a critical vulnerability, tools like firewalls can help put in place some blocks that might help you buy some time to get that vulnerability patched. Of course though, it comes with its own risks where you might start blocking legitimate services and disrupting the business. Now my final thought on the lessons we can learn from WannaCry is the benefits of EDR. That's endpoint detection and response, and I've talked about it a lot on my LinkedIn, the value I see in EDR. If you have it on all of your hosts, you're in a really good place in terms of host-based security, and undoubtedly it would have had an impact if you were hit by WannaCry. Certainly if I was managing an environment and I knew we were going to be hit by ransomware, I would want EDR deployed everywhere I can put it. So in summary, I think the WannaCry attack was probably a watershed moment for cybersecurity. It showed the global impact of somebody taking, in this case, an exploit which was available to all of us. Anyone could have done what the North Koreans had done and leverage that in a way that would cause such massive disruption. I talked a bit about other lessons earlier, the benefits of rapid patching, defense in depth and compensating controls. I think it's the defense in depth for me that really shines through in the case of WannaCry, because it was clear that lots of organizations undoubtedly were trying to deploy this patch, or were doing the best they can, or maybe they were just ignorant or naive to it. But if you had that defense in depth, those independent overlapping rings of control, that might have been enough to stop things like WannaCry and save the day. That's all I've got time for today. I really hope you found this video interesting. It's my fourth one now. I'm still kind of figuring out the best way to kind of like have my script, my bullet points, and do all the editing. So I hope it's come together. I hope you found this interesting, and I will be back again soon with more.